Welcome, brothers and sisters, to the Mormon Movie Reviews, where LDS movie lovers belong. My name is D-Base. We will be reviewing the Mormon Temple Endowment film, running time about 90 minutes, and I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. Now, your synopsis is this is a montage of scenes depicting the creation of the world, which is followed by a dramatization of the travails of Adam and Eve, as they are tempted by Lucifer, ejected from the Garden of Eden, and taught by heavenly messengers. Audience members make the same covenants as Adam and Eve during the course of the film. I'm going to give you a sensitivity warning here. I'm trying not to talk about anything in this film that has not been publicly made available by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is absolutely not an expose, but just a review of the movie portion of the endowment ceremony and how that has changed. Now, there's actually 4 parts of the endowment ordinance. You have the initiatory, the endowment itself, which includes the film, and the sealing, and then the second anointing. Today, we're going to discuss the endowment movie portion only. So the film to endowment is actually a combination of both film and audio recordings. The portions shown on film are the creation, much of the garden sequence, and the world room sequence up until Adam initiates to heed the counsel of the messengers, and the rest of the ceremony is presented on audio tape. Now, what is the endowment ceremony? President Brigham Young said of the endowment, "Let me give you a definition of it in brief. Your endowment is to receive all those ordinances in the house of the Lord, which are necessary for you after you have departed this life to enable you to walk back to the presence of the Father, passing the angels who stand as sentinels, being able to give them the keywords, the signs, and tokens pertaining to the holy priesthood, and gain your eternal exaltation in spite of earth and hell." Wow, what a that seems like it's pretty important. This film, it's on IMDb, and it only has a rating, though, of 4.2 out of 10 stars. We've been told for many years that the endowment is a sacred but not secret, but that is absolutely no longer the case anymore. Every portion of the temple now has been filmed by certain individuals on candid cameras, and possibly the most famous of those is a dude named Noah. If you want to have a real expose and you actually want to watch the film, then you can go over to his website. I actually did reach out to Mike Norton regarding this review. The temple film, it's not a copyrighted film. So the church really can't ask a new name Noah to remove his videos because it's not copyrighted. The development of the Mormon Temple Endowment Ceremony here by David John Berger, that was very helpful. Although, again, this concentrates a lot on the actual ceremony and not on the movie. We're going to be concentrating on the movie and the movie only. But I did take some of my reviewed comments from here. That was very helpful. And another important book that I purchased for this was by Mr. Devery Anderson, The Development of LDS Temple Worship, 1846 to 2000, a documentary history hardcover. It's a really, really good book. There are at least 7 versions of this film, some of which have been lost to history. Now, the Salamander Society and others have tried to piece them all together, but the historic record is spotty. I really have to pull in a lot of sources, which I tried to do for this review. Why and how was this movie created? We have to go back to 1953. The Bern, Switzerland temple here is where it all started. So in 1953, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the LDS Church, the Swiss temple, it was going to be dedicated, which is a big milestone in church history. This is the first temple in Europe, the first outside of North America. However, the Swiss government would not authorize a giant 150,000 square foot structure, which was needed for a live endowment presentation, which takes place across multiple rooms. So that's a problem. So this is where we are starting to get the genesis of the single room endowment. But it's not just a space issue. There's also other issues that are involved, which I didn't realize until I did the research for this film. In the early 1950s, there were 8 temples in operation for the church: St. George, Logan, Manti, Salt Lake Temple, Laie, Hawaii, Cardston, Alberta, Mesa, Arizona, and Idaho Falls Temple. All of the endowments in all of these temples are basically mostly done in English. Up until the early 1950s, there's no movie yet that had been shot for the endowments. All of them were done live. In just a few years, temples were to be built, as I said, in Switzerland and also in Hamilton, New Zealand temple and in London. The Switzerland temple was set to be dedicated in 1955, and since this temple was centrally located and unique to Europe, it needed to serve saints in many different languages. So it would also be impossible for the Swiss temple with the many different languages needed for the endowment to be able to be staffed all the time for lots of different languages coming in. So in the English temples, you can just go and you really didn't even honestly need an appointment probably during this time. You can just show up, they do an English endowment, and you're good to go. The problem is that if you're in a Europe temple and many different languages you come, you have to have live actors that are available then to do the endowment in your language. So if you're talking about 15, 20 different European languages here, you're coming to the temple, you have a big logistical issue. It's not just a space issue of going in between rooms, you have a language issue of being able to staff the temple with the appropriate languages. I'm trying to give you church approved sources here. I want to read this to you from President David O. McKay. He was the president of the church there starting, I believe, in 1950, but during the time of 1953, he was the president of the church who was overseeing, obviously, temple operations. He made an entry into his diary on October 29th. David O. McKay, he recorded in his diary that he had decided to form a committee to begin preparations for the sound and pictures of the temple ceremony. This committee would include Elder Joseph Fielding Smith, Richard L. Evans of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and Gordon B. Hinckley, Secretary of the Missionary Committee, and architect Edward O. Anderson. Again, this is a space issue, so that's why we have an architect involved as well. President Hinckley is involved because he worked for Deseret News. He knows a lot about media. President McKay indicated that under the direction of the general authorities on the committee, Brother Hinckley would have the prime responsibility for completing this assignment in time for the temple's dedication 2 years later. Speaking of the Swiss temple, it was a charge of enormous significance. Gordon B. Hinckley's biographer declared the ramifications of this project were enormous, as they would extend far beyond the temple in Switzerland. So in the Salt Lake Temple on the 5th floor, the same place where James Talmage completed Jesus the Christ, President Hinckley also pondered this project, including on Saturdays and some Sunday mornings, quote, poring over the language of the temple ceremony, sketching out ideas and pleading with the Lord for guidance. President McKay closely followed the temple-related developments with fatherly concern. He later remarked, there is no other man in the church who has done so much in assisting to carrying this new temple plan to the saints of the world as has Brother Hinckley, end quote. So when it comes to the Mormon Temple Endowment film, no one who was involved was more important than President Hinckley. Although some of the scenes were shot at various locations in California and Utah, the new films were produced in the large assembly room occupying the upper half of the Salt Lake Temple. Soon, this ornate hall was converted into a makeshift movie set. They hung a huge floor-to-ceiling scrim as a backdrop for the cameras and used heavy-duty pulleys to lift various props through the room's large windows. All this was done in such as ways to avoid attracting the attention of temple workers. After a year of grueling work, mostly on weekends, the English-language film was completed, and the following month, separate films were produced in French, German, Dutch, Finnish, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, each featuring a distinct cast made up of primarily of immigrants and returned missionaries who spoke those languages. Rather than using live actors to present portions of the endowment's film, they were going to be done on film for the first time. And therefore, when Swiss saints in particular went into the temple, they could just pop in the film. You see these languages here are mostly European languages, French, German, Dutch, Finnish, Swedish. These are mostly European languages, so that the saints who came in, they could pop in the film, they could do the endowment ceremony with the film portion of it, and you actually wouldn't need any workers on staff who could speak those particular languages, because you could just watch the film and participate in that way. This film that we've just discussed here, that is what I call version 1, filmed in 1953 to 1954, mostly at night, 5th floor assembly room. Now, it was directed by Harold I. Hansen, who was a theater professor at BYU. He's best known probably for doing 40 years of the Hill Cumorah pageant, but I guess has been discontinued for a number of reasons. Now, he was the head of the drama department at BYU during this time. There is no film department at BYU in 1953. So I've read that it was shot using 16 millimeter film. It's a clip that shows the difference between shooting on a 16 millimeter film, which is on the right, and shooting on a 35 millimeter film, which is on the left. You would start getting 35 millimeter films, say maybe in the 60s. You can see the quality difference between a 16 millimeter and a 35 millimeter. You can tell that there's a significant difference in the quality. So it would have been somewhat rudimentary. There is no BYU Motion Picture Studio at this time. And that's why I believe that the church founded the BYU Motion Picture Studio right after this, because they realized that the church needed a dedicated cinematic arm for projects like this, because again, the Swiss Temple was going to be dedicated in 1955, and there would be other projects that would be necessary for the church to have films with too. It wasn't a very sophisticated film. in some respects. It was mostly just a reenactment of the endowment ceremony. However, at the beginning of the film, there were creation scenes that were not live action, which I'm going to discuss here in a moment. We have a picture here of the creation room. Okay, so this is again the type of scenes that this would have been shot at. Creation room here. Now, this would not have been shot. This is the baptistry, which would not have been part of the endowment. But here we have, as I mentioned earlier, the garden room. The temple instructions and ordinances are for the spiritually minded, for mature disciples of the Lord. And then you also have the world room. So these are the types of places that this first film would have been shot in. That these are the rooms that you would normally walk through, but that was not possible in the Swiss temple because you didn't have the space. Finally, you have the celestial room here. Eventually, this same version 1 film, it was shot in Samoan, Tahiti, Tongan, and Maori for the use in the New Zealand temple, which was the 10th operating temple. This also made it possible that if someone spoke a different language, was attending a mostly English-speaking temple, that he or she could do an endowment in his or her own language. Most members of the church have never seen what I'm calling this version 1, as it was only used basically in international temples during the 1950s and 60s, like the Swiss temple, like the New Zealand temple, like some of these other international temples. If you went to the Salt Lake temple, you wouldn't see this because it was still being done in live action. If you went to the Logan temple, again, you wouldn't see it. So this is a film that has been seen by a very small amount of people, only active Latter-day Saints going to visit international temples in the 1950s and 60s. A few tens of thousands of people. That's my guess. Now, this film version, which I'm calling version 1, it may be lost to history, but it's probably sitting in a restricted church vault somewhere. What would you wear to go and see one of these temple ceremonies? They have released what you're going to wear when you go to go visit this movie, because when you go to this movie, you don't just wear normal street clothes. Okay, you have to wear special clothes. So what would those clothes have looked like? You have to wear special clothes, and as this video shows, you have to wear special underclothes as well. So let's look at what the church has released as to what you have to wear to watch this movie.
Temple robes of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known as the robes of the Holy Priesthood, are worn only inside Mormon temples and reserved for the highest sacraments of the faith. White symbolizes purity. There is no insignia or rank. The highest apostle and the newest member are indistinguishable when dressed in the same way. Men and women wear similar clothing. The simple vestments combine religious symbolism with echoes of antiquity reflected in ancient writings from the Book of Exodus. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there are no outer religious vestments in ordinary worship services. However, many faithful Latter-day Saints wear a garment under their clothing that has deep religious significance. Similar in design to ordinary modest underclothing, it comes in 2 pieces and is usually referred to as the temple garment.
You can purchase this temple garment at various stores called distribution centers. That is what you need to wear in order to be able to go and see the Mormon Temple movie. Now, as I said, there's live action portions of the film, but the film also represents the creation. So the version 1 film actually includes scenes and sequences that was from Walt Disney's Fantasia. Version 2 of the film, as I said, there's 7 versions of this film. This was known from my sources as Project 134. We have a new director for this, which was Judge Wetzel O. Whitaker, who was his nickname was Judge. Now, speaking of Disney, as we saw from that last clip, Wetzel O. Whitaker came over from the Disney studios. The church picked him up and asked him to form the BYU Motion Picture Studio in the mid 1950s. He's the one who brought us the version 2 of the film. Now, this was shot on campus at BYU inside of the motion picture studio. I have a picture of the BYU soundstage here. This is probably one of these sound stages is probably where the film was shot. Now, I understand here that the outside scenes, they were shot, I believe my sources say in southern Utah. I don't know that for a fact. President Hinckley, once again, he dedicated the BYU Motion Picture Studio as kind of a temple-like location. And he also headed up this film as well. And we're starting to get a little more sophisticated in our production techniques at this point. And starting in 1966, that's where we don't need the Fantasia clips anymore. The church maybe licensed that. Those clips were licensed at a 5-year span, so you had to renew the copyright on those with Disney every 5 years. So maybe the church did it a couple of times, but starting in 1966, the church wanted all of the rights to the film, and so they shot their own film. We do know who the cast of this particular film is. I want to show you a little bit of what I believe the cast would be. The cast, we know who Adam is, we know who Eve is, and in fact, Peter, he comes back as Harold I. Hansen, who was the director of the 1953. Some of the individuals involved, we don't know, like Jehovah, we don't know who the voice is of Jehovah. However, all of the actors in version 2 of the film, they were required to have temple recommends and needed special bishops' clearance interviews. They also needed to memorize all of their lines, as a script could not be taken home. Now, this film was perhaps 2 hours long in 1966. Believe it or not, just a couple of years later in 1969, we have version 3 of the film that is getting shot. Now, this was a bit shorter in length, and I want to show you from the Salamander Society, we have a lot of information here about the 1963 version, which was a very popular version of the Temple Endowment film. This version of it was a bit shorter than version 2. They cut it down in length. Again, we're looking at the 1969 version. Some more famous temple actors here, including Gordon Jump, who's perhaps the most famous LDS actor of all time. We also had Ron Fredrickson, who played in a number of church movies. And we had Bryce Chamberlain, who did the voice of Jehovah. He's in Man's Search for Happiness. He's in Love is for the Birds. Did a lot of church films. We have a lot more information about the 1969 version than we do about other versions. People say, the endowment ceremony, the endowment movie in particular, it's being changed. Sure, yeah, it's been changed a lot of times. Now, this particular film, it was started in 1969 and it was completed in 1971. And again, it took 2 years, a long time. And I am speculating here, but I believe that it took that long because we had to span 3 church presidents. When you have 3 church presidents that are getting involved with the film, they're all going to want their own take on it. So in 1969, we had David O. McKay. In 1970, we had Joseph Fielding Smith. And in 1971, we have Harold B. Lee. And when you have 3 different church presidents get involved, that's gonna gum up the works a little bit, because it was only shot in between the hours of 10 to midnight. That's why it took so long. Now, the inside scenes, as I said, they were shot at BYU Motion Picture Studio. And instead of the 1966 version, which is where the outside scenes, the creation scenes, were shot in southern Utah, in this time, the outside scenes were actually shot out on the West Coast. Now, in version number 4, this is sometime in the mid-1970s. Now, I have read speculation that there were multiple versions of version 4. I would say that I am somewhat confident that there's only one version. This, again, was shot on BYU campus in the 1970s. And once again, we have another version that is coming to us by Harold B. Lee. Harold B. Lee, he did not like the 1969 film, even though it was commissioned under his tenure. He didn't like it. Especially there was some of the actors who he didn't like their portrayal. They had too long of hair, they had too long of sideburns, they had facial hair. There were certain things that he did not like. The 1970s version was partially processed in a California lab, whereas the sound was processed in the Salt Lake Temple and in the basement. Now, some of the audio tracks were recorded in London. Probably those London audio tracks were the recordings of the people with European foreign languages, so they wouldn't have to fly them all the way over to BYU. They recorded them in London to make it easier. Whereas some of the Pacific Island audio tracks, they were recorded in BYU, Hawaii. So you have live actors on screen portraying things, but then you would dub over the foreign languages. You would basically only had one version of the film that was shot in English, but then you would dub everybody else over. It was intended to replace version 3, but it did not do so very quickly because people preferred version 3 over this version 4. The major goal of the version 4 was to make it look not dubbed as possible. Version number 5 here was shot in 1988. So we have version number 4 and version number 3 that are circulating simultaneously at this time in different temples. Now in version number 5, we are taken to the time frame of 1988. BYU Motion Picture Studio, it was being renamed right around the 1990s timeframe. I don't have the exact date for you, but it was renamed the LDS Motion Picture Studio, and it started to report to Salt Lake directly instead of going through BYU. Now, this version number 5 here that we're going to discuss here, this is the only version that I'm aware of that there were no outside scenes shot. Now, the director of this particular version was version number 5. Wetzel Whitaker has passed away by this time. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have gotten the nod. At this time, we have the director of Peter Johnson. He's a motion picture writer, producer, and director. He started his film in Hollywood, but then he ended it with the LDS Motion Picture Studio. He shot some of the most famous LDS films of all time, including Mr. Kruger's Christmas, a big favorite of mine, The Mountain of the Lord, also a big favorite, and a couple of other ones. Why is there a version 5? Why not just keep it with version 3 and 4? Well, part of it was in response to this particular survey that the church sent out from the Church Family and History Department, which queried Latter-day Saints regarding their particular experiences with so-called genealogy or family search, and particularly the church's endowment ceremony. What were the circumstances of your endowment? How did you feel about it? The experience was unpleasant. Were you confused? Were you uplifted? Briefly describe how you felt after receiving your own endowment. And this person who filled this one out said that they felt weird. I don't think that they're alone in that feeling, as we're going to discuss here in a moment. Since receiving your own endowment, how many times have you gone back? Do you have a valid temple recommend? And it asks a lot of different questions. People are speculating that in response to this particular survey, that they decided to change and alter some of the temple endowment movie based on the reaction that they got from this particular survey. So this version 5, specifically the 1988 version, there was actually 2 versions of the version 5 film. There was one that was shot in 1988, and then there was another one that was shot in 1990. But this, perhaps the 1988 version in particular, is probably the most popular Mormon temple endowment film of all time. More people perhaps have watched this version than any other, because it was shot in 1988. According to my sources, it lasted in some temples all the way until 2018, because it was the most popular version. So it lasted for 30 years. Even as new versions came out, a lot of temples didn't want to replace it because it was the most popular. It's also my favorite version of the film. I'm speculating here that it was not actually released until 1990. Now, there was a version 5.1 of this film that was shot in 1990 mostly at the LDS Motion Picture Studio, but the outside scenes were shot in Wyoming. And again, this was also directed by Peter Johnson. This version 5.0 film and accompanying ceremony, the ceremony was changed quite significantly in 1990, and certain elements of the temple in particular were removed, including the so-called penalties, sectarian preacher, the lecture at the veil, and the 5 points of fellowship. They were all removed. Elder Holland gave a famous interview to the BBC back in 2012, in which he was specifically asked about this version of the endowment. I'm giving you something that is publicly available.
Let's see how the apostle responds to this concern.
Let's talk about Mitt Romney.
Okay.
The man who may well become the most powerful man on earth.
Mm-hmm.
As a Mormon in the temple, I've been told, he would have sworn an oath to say that he would not pass on what happens in the temple, lest he slit his throat. Is that true?
That's not true. That's not true. We do not have penalties in the temple.
This is the part that really ticked off a lot of people about this interview. And that is that Elder Holland himself, when he went through the temple his first time, he did the pantomiming of his own death. He knows that there were penalties in the temple, and he's using weaselly language to try to pull one over on this journalist by saying, no, we don't have penalties in the temple. He knows full well that when Mitt Romney first went through the temple, he also swore that oath. Because remember, when Mormons go through the first time, they're going for themselves. Every time they go after that, they're doing a proxy ordinance for somebody else. But the first time when he took the oath himself, it included those penalties. And so Elder Holland tries to pull one over on the journalist and say, no, we do not have penalties in the temple. Now, if the journalist was not really pressing for information and simply took the answer and said, okay, well, that's fine, then we wouldn't know anything different. But the journalist doesn't do that. Let's keep going.
That's not true. We do not have penalties in the temple.
You used to.
We used to.
Therefore, he swore an oath saying, I will not tell anyone about the secrets here, lest I slit my throat.
The journalist does a really good job here. He redirects reaffirms that, yes, in fact, the question that he asked, the answer is yes, there were penalties, and Mitt Romney himself swore that oath. And so now Jeffrey R. Holland has to say, oh, okay, well, now I have to reframe what the oath actually was so it doesn't sound as bad as it was. So let's see how that goes.
Well, the vow that was made was regarding the ordinance of the temple.
The reason that I'm including that is to show that this has been acknowledged by church leaders, that especially in 1990, that the endowment ceremony was significantly changed, and the movie that corresponds with it. So I'm not telling you something that church leaders themselves. We have the music from this particular version of the temple, and a lot of it sounds, and I cannot tell you if it exactly, if the church licensed it from John Williams and this film, which is The Empire of the Sun. But all I can tell you is that it sounds exactly like it. We're done with version 5. Now, there's only 2 more versions left, which is why I want to discuss version 6 and version 7. So starting in 2013 and 2014, the LDS Church begins using a new temple film. Ha! And this was produced by Sterling Van Wagenen. Many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who worshiped at an LDS temple this week saw something unexpected, a new film. Whoa, it's a new movie. So since the 1970s, a portion of the LDS temple instruction has been provided through pre-recorded media, including film. They said 1970s, but I believe that it was more like 1966, late 1960s, as I mentioned before. Beginning this week, a new temple film is being shown in several LDS temples. The new temple film is the first update in more than 20 years. There has been no changes to the script. English language copies of the new film are being sent to temples over the next few weeks and will subsequently be translated into other languages. There was some controversy that surrounded this new LDS film director. He's a Sundance co-founder, and he admitted to child molestation claims, and he's the one who directed the church films. He's a child molester. So between 2013 and 2014, the church made 3 brand new films, as we saw there from the Church News article, with cutting edge visuals and effects and sets, costuming, actors, very high production quality. Now, these 3 films, plus maybe the 1988 version, they were in simultaneous circulation in the church's temples for several years. I believe that the order that they were released was, there was a version that was released in July 2013, which I call Film B. There was a one released in January of 2013, which I call Film C. And then there's one released in July of 2014, which is Film D. As I'm going to bring to your attention that because of these child molestation charges, the church is going to have to redo the films. You really can't have an LDS temple film director who's ended child abuse. Now, these particular films that Mr. Van Wagenen brought to us, they were about 16 minutes longer than version 5. And the reason that they were longer probably is so that the polysyllabic languages would have more time to be dubbed in. Jana Reese, she said that the production quality on these particular films, they are better. The music is improved. And that's about it. As one person put it to me, it's exactly the same, except that Adam and Eve and Satan all have better hair. So like I said, there's no script change. It's just production quality. The version 5 of the films, it was retired starting in about 2019. Okay, so as soon as these accusations and allegations came to light and they were substantiated and admitted to it, they had to retire version 5. So that was perhaps the most short-lived of all of the versions of the Temple Endowment film. In 2019, there was significant changes to the church endowment film once again. LDS Church changes temple ceremony, and faithful feminists will see revisions and additions as a leap forward. Now, the vast majority of people who've gone through the endowment since 2019, since these major changes were brought forward, they have said that it is a massive improvement. Senior church leaders wanted to push immediately through the 2019 changes. They also, this is the same time frame that the allegations against the previous producer were brought to light. But they haven't had time to film a new temple endowment film. They want these new changes to go forward, and they want to retire the old videos. The problem is that there's not enough time to do all that. So what to do? These changes that the church leaders wanted to put through were much different than the minor changes that Harold B. Lee wanted to put through back in the 1970s, where there were just, minor problems that could be edited out in post-production. That wouldn't work here. In my opinion, this is kind of an example of the cart being put before the horse. So on January 1st, 2019, the church made major changes to all of the temple and endowment ordinances. And this is from the church's website itself, admitted to this. The scope of those changes necessitated changing the films as well, specifically the version 5, which is the 1988/1990, which was still in circulation in some temples, along with the film versions B, C, and D, which were taken out of circulation. So these live action films were replaced with a slideshow with voiceovers. The slides were taken from stock footage and stills from previous temple films, mostly the 2013 to 2014 films. The simplified production made both translation and making future changes much easier. If you want an exhaustive list of all of the temple changes that were done, you can look through Jonathan Streeter's film account here, which shows you exactly what was changed in 2019. Some people, however, might find that to be offensive. Now, according to New Name Noah, version 7.0 is probably either being filmed right now or is scheduled to be filmed soon. He told me that the new version is hoped to be released for the Salt Lake Temple dedication re-release. Have been some famous actors that have shown up in these Temple Endowment films. Probably the most famous is Corbin Alred. He's probably the most recognizable. He was in Saints and Soldiers and a couple of other LDS films. The film strip version, which you could call version 7.0, that is the best way to go because future changes can easily be made without reshooting the entire movie. Now, it seems odd to go back to like film strip stills. So you just put up a film strip and it's just a single still. But there's a big problem with a live action film for the Temple Endowment ceremony. If you need to tweak even one scene or make even one change, you basically have to reshoot the entire film. You can't just reshoot one scene 3 years later, for instance, because actors age and it would look odd. Many people have noted some actors even end up leaving the church for various reasons. So that's why using a film stills is the best thing because you can adapt it. You can also dub in the long languages, plenty of time. It looks odd to have someone on the screen who's speaking in English and have it be dubbed over in a different language. So the film strip version is actually, in my opinion, the best way to go, except for one thing. What I think the church really needs to do is make an endowment film that is all CGI, like a James Cameron Avatar scene on Pandora. Then scenes could easily be made and swapped in and out at will. You would also be able to have the different languages easily. All the languages would match. It could easily be swapped in and out, make changes, different languages, different lengths. You'd never have to worry about, for instance, Satan getting arrested, which I'm not going to show you that, but yeah, Satan did get arrested. So CGI, that's the best way to go. Now let's take a look at some of the user reviews from IMDb, which I think are very, very good. The film seems like a reheated Masonic temple ceremony. Saves your soul, but emptiness follows. The strangest movie you'll never see. Definitely not worth the entrance fee. Or here's a 10 out of 10. Entertainment. No, it serves a higher purpose. Ooh. This is actually, in my opinion, the most expensive movie that you could possibly see in world history. Why? Because to watch this movie in an LDS temple, you have to pay tithing, which, depending on how much you make, could make this the most expensive film that you will ever see. If you actually look at the highest grossing films of all time, we're talking about Avatar, Avengers Endgame, Titanic, Star Wars Episode 7, that have grossed over $3 billion, they hold nothing compared to this film. They are not even in the same league as this film, okay? Because the church takes in about $6-7 billion in tithing every year. Now, that is not specifically just for the Temple Endowment film. A lot of it is. The church is taking in $6 billion every single year, and this Temple Endowment film is a requirement if you want to be a member in good standing. So if you want to lump in the lifetime tithing earnings, which directly go for this film dwarfs all the others when it comes to lifetime gross earnings. The church, it teaches that watching this movie is necessary for exaltation. Mostly, I watched version 5 of the film, which is probably the most popular version of all time, is certainly seen by probably a couple million active Latter-day Saints. I attended this movie for the first time in the Provo, Utah temple in 1997. However, I also did baptisms for the dead many times before seeing this movie. I knew that there were outfits already from being in the locker room / changing rooms from doing baptisms for the dead. And everybody knew about the garments. Now, you can't go through the temple movie until you're at least 18, but you can do baptisms for the dead starting when you're 12. So I knew that some people were doing some things in the temple that required unusual outfits. And then I knew somewhat what to expect from reading the quotes of Brigham Young and from some conversations with family and friends, although there's still much that was left out that could not be learned outside of the house of the Lord. Now, I thought that it was a very special experience. It was very overwhelming to watch the film, and I definitely did not understand everything when I went through it the first time. But, as one might imagine from watching any movie many times, the experience over time, it becomes definitely more mundane, and maybe it lost some of whatever charm that it had. Now, Deborah Anderson's book, it was a real help in researching this review. In some ways, it has taken me about 25 years to really understand the Temple Endowment movie. There is still much left to learn and understand. There's many gaps in my knowledge. I was very hesitant about even doing this review. So perhaps in that way, the quest for further light knowledge that the Father promised to send us by watching this film, it has been fulfilled in my own life. Thanks so much for joining me for the Mormon Movie Reviews, where LDS movie lovers belong. Please drop a like and leave a comment and a subscription. And join us next time for another episode of the Mormon Movie Reviews, where LDS movie lovers belong, which is when we're going to review The Body is a Temple. So long.